Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources, articles, research, and our own notes, and extract the most important nuggets of knowledge or insight for you. Think of it as your shortcut to being truly well-informed, with surprising facts and just enough humor to keep you hooked. Today we're plunging into a topic that affects every single one of us, whether we realize it or not: cycles. From the changing seasons to the rhythm of day and night, these cyclical patterns are, well, a fundamental force. They shape our very existence, right? Dictating everything from what we wear to how we plan our vacations. But here's the fascinating part. These predictable patterns aren't just confined to the natural world. They extend powerfully, and often dramatically, into the realm of investing and economics. And they hold profound lessons for how we approach our financial lives. Our mission today: to unpack these rhythms and help you discern the hidden opportunities and risks they present.
Indeed. And that's precisely why understanding cycles is so crucial for anyone navigating the financial world. Our deep dive today is heavily influenced by an expert investor's extensive work, where he explicitly states that an understanding of cycles is right near the top of the list for successful investing. Now, in his prior writings, he did label 19 other elements as the most important thing, which, well, it means he doesn't believe there's a single all-encompassing secret.
Okay.
However, he places cycles in a profoundly prominent position. He attributes the vast bulk of his firm, Oak Tree Capital Management's decades of success, which is considerable, by the way, to good cycle timing. That, combined with, an effective investment approach and the involvement of exceptional people.
Right.
This really highlights how an astute grasp of where we are in a cycle allows investors to do a superior job of positioning portfolios for what lies ahead. It's not just about what you invest in, but when and how much you commit.
So it's not just identifying the cycle, but strategically acting on it, almost like tuning your sails to the prevailing winds, rather than just knowing they exist. It's fascinating that someone who's already written about the most important things would then dedicate an entire book solely to cycles. What was the driving force behind that decision?
That's a perfect analogy. You've hit on the core there. His motivation for writing an entire book on cycles comes down to a few key reasons. First, he admits finding something particularly intriguing about the fluctuations of cycles. There's an inherent intellectual curiosity, observing these complex, repeating patterns.
Sure.
Second, and perhaps more practically, his clients constantly approach him, asking about where they stand in the current market cycle. That indicates a widespread interest and, crucially, a general lack of clarity on the subject, even among sophisticated investors.
Right. Even the pros are asking.
Exactly. And third, and perhaps most importantly for him, he noted the striking scarcity of existing literature dedicated solely to the fundamental nature and mechanics of cycles. Despite their undeniable influence, few had truly delved into their core mechanics in a systematic way. His core message then becomes strikingly clear: we should listen to cycles. And he uses listen in two distinct, powerful senses. First, to attend closely for the purpose of hearing, meaning be acutely aware of what's happening around us, discerning the subtle signals and shifts. It's about being deeply attuned to the market's subtle shifts, so you can almost feel the building tension before a storm, or the quiet calm before a breakthrough.
That kind of deep observation.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And second, and equally crucial, to heed, to obey, bear in mind, be guided by, or take to heart the lessons these cycles present. This is the discipline to change your behavior based on what you hear, even when the crowd is shouting a different tune.
It's the difference between hearing a fire alarm and actually evacuating the building.
You got it. He warns that the consequences of not listening, of disregarding where one stands in a cycle, are severe. Investors who fail to do so are bound to suffer serious consequences. It's about absorbing the lesson and following its dictates, not just passively hearing about it.
We all crave certainty, don't we? Especially when it comes to money. Everyone wants to know what the macro future holds for economies, markets, geopolitics. But as our expert cautions, predicting that future is largely a fool's errand, then how do we arm ourselves? How does understanding these cycles actually help us navigate a world that seems inherently unpredictable?
That's a fundamental question, and it's where many investors go astray. Our expert is quite dismissive of macro prediction as a reliable source of investment success for most people because, as he bluntly puts it, few people are able, on balance, to know more about the macro future than others. If you don't possess a distinct, consistent knowledge advantage over the collective market in forecasting things like GDP growth, interest rates, or geopolitical events, well, then your forecasts are unlikely to lead to outperformance. It's essentially a coin flip, right?
Yeah.
Instead, he suggests that sustainable success comes from focusing on the knowable, understanding the fundamentals of specific industries, companies, individual securities, being disciplined about paying the appropriate price for those assets, and critically, understanding the investment environment we're in and deciding how to strategically position our portfolios.
Ah, okay.
This last part, the strategic positioning, calibrating your portfolio to the current environment rather than trying to guess the next one, is precisely where cycles become invaluable. It's not about predicting what will happen with certainty, but rather preparing for what might happen and what the probabilities suggest.
So if we're not aiming for certainty, then what we're really seeking is insight into tendencies. Can you explain what he means by that? It sounds less definitive, but still, incredibly powerful.
Indeed, tendencies is a key concept here, and it's where sophisticated investing truly begins. Since macro forecasting doesn't offer certainty, and even the most brilliant minds get it wrong regularly, we speak in terms of what might or should happen and how likely they are to happen. He illustrates this with a simple yet profound analogy. Imagine a jar with 100 balls, some black, some white.
Okay.
If you know nothing about the ratio, picking a ball is pure guessing a 50.50 chance. But if you know there are 70 black balls and 30 white ones, you have a knowledge advantage.
Right.
Now, you still don't know the color of the next ball that will be picked. Certainty is elusive. However, you know it's more likely to be black. This probabilistic insight allows you to win more often than you lose in the long run if you bet on black at even odds.
Got it.
The superior investor, in this context, has insight into future tendencies based on current conditions. This insight allows them to tilt the odds in their favor without needing to predict the future with absolute certainty. It's about probabilistic thinking and intelligent positioning, not crystal ball gazing. This approach tells us how to prepare for the future without requiring that we be able to predict it down to the last decimal point. It's like knowing the blackjack dealer is showing a 5. You don't know if they'll bust, but the tendency is higher for them to do so, right?
That analogy of the jar with the balls is brilliant. It cuts through so much of the noise around forecasting and crystallizes exactly what we can know. It really shifts the goal from predicting a single outcome to understanding the probabilities. So building on that, he also often uses the metaphor of a pendulum, right?
Yeah.
What's the connection there? Are cycles and pendulums fundamentally the same?
They are, in his view. He argues there's no fundamental difference between cycles and pendulums. Both oscillate around a midpoint or a secular trend. If you visualize a pendulum swinging and then imagine dragging its hang point steadily from left to right as it oscillates, well, you naturally get a wave, which is a visual representation of a cycle.
Okay, I see that.
This analogy highlights the core idea that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. While the specific reasons and details and timing and extent of cycles may vary from one instance to the next, the underlying dynamics are usually similar. A crucial insight here is that the movement from an extreme back toward the midpoint almost never halts at the midpoint.
It overshoots.
Exactly. Due to inherent momentum, it overshoots, continuing towards the opposite extreme. For instance, markets rarely stop precisely at fairly priced after recovery. They tend to continue into overpriced territory before eventually correcting.
Right.
This inherent overshooting, driven by both physical laws in a pendulum and psychological forces in markets, is a dependable pattern that investors absolutely need to recognize. It's rarely a gentle return to equilibrium. It's usually a push past it.
That image of the pendulum constantly overshooting really sticks with you. It suggests cycles aren't just passive sequences of events, but something more active. Am I right in thinking he sees them almost like a chain reaction, where each event causes the next?
Precisely. This is one of his most important points about the underlying nature of cycles. They're not just a series of disconnected events happening one after another. Instead, each event in a cycle causes the next. Think again of that physical pendulum. It stores potential energy as it swings towards an extreme, converts that into kinetic energy as it rushes back, reaches its maximum velocity at the midpoint, and then its momentum causes it to overshoot the midpoint.
Right, converting back to potential energy.
Exactly. Converting kinetic energy back into potential energy at the opposite extreme. In the economic and investment worlds, this causative nature is driven not by gravity or physics, but primarily by fluctuations in psychology. These psychological swings, shifts in optimism, pessimism, greed, and fear, are the most important deviations from the general long-term trend. He acknowledges that various cycles operate on their own, often with distinct drivers, but they also continuously affect each other, creating a complex and dynamic jumble of interrelated phenomena. It's incredibly complex, but understanding these cause and effect relationships, the way one extreme pushes the system towards the next, is vital for grasping how the entire system works.
And despite this intricate interplay and the clear lessons of history, people constantly fall into the trap of thinking, this time it's different.
Yeah.
It's like we collectively forget the lessons of the past with each new generation or each new technology. Why is that?
That's perhaps the greatest challenge for investors. He asserts that cycles are inevitable. The fundamental human tendency to extrapolate the recent trend, to assume that current conditions, whether good or bad, will continue indefinitely, is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it really is.
But, he insists, the old rules do still apply. Trees don't grow to the sky, meaning nothing can go up indefinitely, and very few things genuinely go to zero permanently. He highlights the extreme brevity of the financial memory, a phrase popularized by John Kenneth Galbraith, who noted how new, often youthful, and supremely self-confident generations consistently hail recurring circumstances as brilliantly innovative discovery, dismissing past experience as the primitive refuge.
How?
Mark Twain's quote, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme," captures this perfectly. The underlying themes and mechanisms are consistent, even if the specific details and players vary. For example, the 2007-08 global financial crisis wasn't solely about subprime mortgages. It was fundamentally about excessive optimism, a pervasive shortage of risk aversion, and an overly generous capital market that collectively led to unsafe behavior.
Right, the conditions allowed it to happen.
Exactly. While experience is a powerful, albeit often painful teacher, as the saying goes, experience is what you got when you didn't get what you wanted, it's also a very slow one. We typically only see one major cycle per decade, meaning a full career might only offer a handful of opportunities to learn from these extreme swings. This deep dive, and his book, aims to speed up that education by drawing on lessons from many such cycles.
So moving on from those fundamental truths about cycles, let's talk about the economic cycle itself. We often hear about GDP and growth rates. How does this fit into the cyclical view? Are we talking about long-term trends or shorter-term ups and downs?
It's both, actually, and distinguishing between them is crucial. He defines GDP, or gross domestic product, as the product of hours worked and output per hour. Simple enough. Long-term economic growth is fundamentally driven by stable factors like birth rates, which influence the size of the workforce, and productivity gains, which means how much each worker can produce. These factors tend to change gradually over decades, creating a long-term secular uptrend as seen in the U.S. economy for many decades, riding on salutary secular trends like a favorable macro environment, robust corporate growth, and a generally optimistic borrowing mentality. However, this long-term trend is no straight line. Short-term fluctuations, such as the economic stagnation of the 1970s marked by the 1973 oil embargo, or the 1998 emerging market crisis, create distinct cycles around the trend line.
Booms and busts.
Precisely. Those are the booms and busts we typically think of as the business cycle. But crucially, he points out that there are even cycles in the long-term trend itself.
Really? Like what?
Like the rise and fall of nations, think of the Roman Empire, or the shifts in economic power from the U.S. to Europe, then Japan's economic sprint and subsequent stagnation, and now perhaps the rise of China and India. These profound, multi-decade shifts are harder to detect in real time because they occur over generations, often exceeding an observer's lifetime.
That's a huge canvas from ancient empires to modern tech booms. So what exactly drives these economic variabilities, both short and long term? Sounds like it's more than just simple supply and demand.
It absolutely is, and it's a complex interplay of factors. For the very long-term trends, population growth directly correlates with more workers and more consumers, naturally leading to higher GDP. The other fundamental driver is productivity, which stems from profound technological and organizational advances like the Industrial Revolution, the widespread adoption of electricity, the computer revolution, and now the information age with artificial intelligence and big data.
Yeah.
These productivity changes are gradual and form the bedrock of long-term growth, not typically short-term cycle drivers. However, for the more observable shorter-term variations and the deviations around that trend line, what he calls the human element plays a significant role. This includes demographic movements like the massive internal migration of millions of Chinese farmers to cities over the last few decades, which significantly boosted their manufacturing base, or sustained Latin American immigration to the U.S., which expands the productive labor supply and consumption despite declining domestic birth rates. Then there's workforce participation and the unemployment rate, which fluctuate dynamically with consumer confidence and business spending. Aspiration, meaning the inherent profit motive and the desire for a better life, can drive people to work harder and innovate more, though this isn't universally consistent. Look at the contrasting average work weeks in the US versus some European countries. Levels of education can deteriorate, negatively affecting a nation's future economic contribution and its ability to innovate. Finally, technology and automation act as constant Darwinian forces. They create entirely new industries and jobs while simultaneously eliminating others, increasing overall productivity but potentially reducing total hours worked in certain sectors. And globalization offers undeniable benefits from specialization in trade, but it also creates differential effects, such as manufacturing job losses in the US due to competition from lower-cost production in places like China. It's a truly multifaceted picture.
And we've recently heard discussions of secular stagnation, the idea that growth is fundamentally slowing. How did that factor into this cyclical view of economic growth? Does it mean the cycles are somehow less powerful?
That's a very relevant and ongoing debate. The school of thought positing secular stagnation suggests that U.S. economic growth has fundamentally slowed down due to factors like declining population growth and a slowdown in productivity gains, particularly over the last decade or two. This slowdown, if it persists, has profound implications for employment, income inequality, and overall societal well-being. He highlights that while population and productivity changes require decades to take full effect, they absolutely can affect a country's long-term economic growth rate. He points to historical examples, how the U.S. surpassed Europe in economic dynamism, Japan's remarkable post-war economic sprint followed by decades of stagnation, and the rapid, sustained growth of emerging markets like China and potentially India.
So it's happened before.
Right. So the secular stagnation argument doesn't negate cycles. Rather, it suggests that the baseline around which the cycles oscillate might itself be flattening. It really emphasizes that even the long-term trend itself isn't a straight, smooth line, but subject to its own gradual, longer cycles, sometimes influenced by profound shifts in demographics and innovation.
Given these inherent economic fluctuations, what role do governments and central banks play in all of this? Do they try to smooth out the cycles, or do they sometimes inadvertently make them worse?
They absolutely try to smooth them out, and it's a constant, often thankless balancing act. Central banks, like the Federal Reserve in the U.S., have famously dual responsibilities: controlling inflation and supporting maximum employment.
Which often conflict.
Precisely. This creates a fundamental tension. On one hand, you have the hawks, who focus intensely on limiting inflation, which often means restraining an overheating economy by reducing the money supply, raising interest rates, or selling government securities. On the other, the doves, who prioritize encouraging employment and economic growth by stimulating the economy through increasing the money supply, lowering interest rates, or buying securities through programs like quantitative easing. Their job is to act counter-cyclically, to deliberately slow the economy during booms and stimulate it during slowdowns. However, and this is a critical point, their insight is limited and uncertain. He poses the very real challenge. If rates are already historically low, but growth remains weak, can rates be raised without choking off what little growth exists? It's an incredibly complex tightrope walk, and they often face criticism regardless of their actions. Governments, on the other hand, primarily use fiscal tools, taxing and spending.
Like tax cuts or stimulus checks.
Exactly. They can cut taxes, increase government spending, or issue direct stimulus checks to stimulate the economy during downturns. Conversely, they can raise taxes and cut spending to slow an overheating economy. Their overarching goal is also to regulate the cycle, ensuring it's not too fast and not too slow. And it's worth noting that exogenous events, external shocks that originate outside the typical economic or financial sphere, can profoundly impact these cycles.
Like Brexit, you mentioned.
Brexit is a great example. That unexpected political decision had significant long-term economic, social, and psychological ramifications, highlighting how non-economic events can suddenly alter long-term growth trajectories, redirect the economic cycle, and deeply impact consumer and business psyches. Think also of a major pandemic like COVID-19. That completely reset assumptions about supply chains, remote work, even social interaction, forcing a reevaluation of economic potential. These are powerful, unpredictable forces.
Beyond the overall economy, how do these cycles manifest in corporate profits? Does every company experience the same ups and downs, or are some more resilient than others?
Not at all. While the collective sales of all businesses broadly reflect GDP, individual companies respond very differently to the economic cycle. Sales responsiveness varies significantly by industry. Industries like industrial raw materials, components, and durable goods, think cars, new homes, or factory equipment, are highly responsive to the economic cycle. When GDP expands, demand for these tends to rise proportionally, sometimes even more so. Conversely, everyday necessities like food, beverages, and medicine are less responsive. People might trade down to cheaper brands in recessions, but they still need to eat and take their medication, right?
Sure.
Similarly, low-cost consumer items and basic necessary services are generally not very volatile.
Yeah.
Then, there are two crucial forms of leverage that amplify these profit cycles: operating leverage and financial leverage.
Leverage. Okay, break those down.
Operating leverage explains how a change in revenue can lead to a greater change in profits. He uses the example of a taxi company. Fixed costs, like office space or car leases, don't change with every ride. Semi-fixed costs, like a larger fleet, only change with significant increases in demand. But variable costs, like gasoline, change proportionally with each trip.
Makes sense.
So a 20% increase in ridership could lead to a considerably greater increase in operating profits because total costs don't rise as much as revenues. But here's the critical part. The flip side is also true. In a downturn, profits can fall much more than sales because those fixed costs still need to be paid even if the revenue isn't coming in. And financial leverage, which involves using debt, further magnifies this effect on net income, which is what shareholders ultimately care about. Imagine a company whose operating profits decline by 33%. If it has substantial debt, the interest payments on that debt are fixed.
Right. The bank still wants its money.
Exactly. This means a 33% operating profit decline could translate into a much larger, say, 67% decline in net income. This is because debt holders are senior and receive their fixed payments first, leaving equity holders in a first loss position, absorbing all the declines until their equity is potentially wiped out. This demonstrates how cyclicality in sales, combined with operating and financial leverage, can lead to dramatic, sometimes devastating swings in a company's bottom line.
So understand that operating leverage is key. It tells you who benefits most in booms and gets crushed in busts.
Precisely. It tells you which companies will see their profits skyrocket in a boom and which will see them evaporate in a bust, even with similar changes in sales.
That's a powerful amplification effect. But what about seemingly idiosyncratic factors or the disruptive impact of technology on a company's profit cycle? Can that completely throw a company's profit cycle off its traditional track?
Absolutely. These factors can completely upend traditional expectations and render past cyclical patterns irrelevant for specific companies or industries. He gives the sobering example of newspapers. For decades, they were considered incredibly defensive investments with stable, predictable profits, seemingly immune to broader economic cycles. People needed local news, advertising was steady.
Right, seems like a safe bet.
Until the internet fundamentally disrupted their business model. Free online content and digital advertising undermined their traditional revenue streams from print subscriptions and classifieds. This illustrated how quickly a seemingly stable business can become vulnerable. This also highlights that technology itself is cyclical. New technologies are born, they prosper, and then they're replaced by still newer ones. This Darwinian nature of economic evolution constantly creates new winners and new losers.
Like landlines to cell phones or Blockbuster to Netflix.
Exactly those kinds of shifts, or from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. Each transition creates immense opportunities for some, but fundamental, sometimes fatal challenges for others. It's a reminder that no industry or company is truly immune to change, and even what appears to be a stable profit cycle can be violently disrupted by innovation, forcing a new, often harsher cycle of its own.
Okay, so we've talked about economic and profit cycles and how external forces like technology can shake things up. But it sounds like the human element, our psychology and emotions, are really the secret sauce that drives these market swings. Tell us more about the pendulum of investor psychology.
This is truly at the heart of understanding market cycles, and it's where much of the book's profound insight lies. He emphasizes that investment markets swing wildly between euphoria and depression, between celebrating positive developments and obsessing over negatives, and thus between being overpriced and underpriced.
Sounds familiar.
It is. This oscillation, driven by collective human emotion, is one of the most dependable features of the investment world. And here's the kicker. Investor psychology tends to spend much more time at the extremes than it does at a happy medium. It's rarely calm and rational. Think of the polarities that define these extremes. Greed and fear, unbounded optimism and crushing pessimism, high risk tolerance and extreme risk aversion, blind credence and deep skepticism, an urgency to buy anything and a panic to sell everything.
They all seem to move together.
They tend to happen in unison, yes, creating powerful waves. The reason this pendulum is so important is that the two strong upward and downward swings of the cycles largely result from and represent psychological excesses in action. It's our emotional reactions, more than the underlying economic reality, that push markets to dizzying highs and terrifying lows.
So greed and fear really drive the market, not just cold, hard numbers?
Absolutely. They are the twin engines of market extremes. When greed dominates, as in the tech stock boom of 1999 or the housing boom before the GFC, everyone wants to buy. Prices are bid up to unsustainable levels, and there's seemingly no fear. Prudent, cautious investors feel foolish for not participating as they watch others get rich.
Yeah, the fear of missing out, FOMO.
Exactly. People readily believe in a new paradigm, a virtuous cycle that could never end. Conversely, when fear takes over, as it did after the Lehman Brothers collapse in 2008, people shrink from buying and often panic sell, pushing prices down dramatically, sometimes far below intrinsic value. This swing in psychology dramatically impacts valuation. He gives a vivid example. In 1999, investors were willing to pay handsomely for telecom companies based on rosy, often speculative predictions of future growth. But by 2001, after the bubble burst, those same companies, with much of their potential still intact, were seen as empty or worthless, and investors wouldn't pay a dime for them. This willingness to value the future, and therefore current assets, swings wildly with the emotional pendulum. He even quotes behavioral economist Carol Tavris, noting how people stay with clearly wrong decisions, throw good money after bad, and reject information that disputes their beliefs, highlighting that the market isn't always rational.
Humans aren't always rational.
Precisely. Ultimately, psychology does swing, and most people's behavior swings with it, driving market movements far beyond mere fundamental changes in the economy or corporate profits.
If psychology swings so dramatically, what does that mean for how investors view risk? Does our collective attitude toward risk also fluctuate cyclically, almost mirroring the greed and fear?
It definitely does, and it's one of the most dangerous aspects of the cycle. The ideal rational investor is diligent, skeptical, and appropriately risk-averse at all times. But the reality is far different. In good times, when markets are soaring, people often dismiss caution, saying, "Risk? What risk? I don't see much that could go wrong."
Famous last words.
Right. They take on excessive leverage, invest in increasingly speculative ventures, and chase every hot trend. In bad times, however, the sentiment flips to, "Get me out, I can't take any more losses," even when assets are cheap. He defines risk primarily as the likelihood of permanent capital loss, but also importantly includes opportunity risk, the risk of missing out on a great return. To understand this, let's look at the risk-return continuum, often called the capital market line. This is a theoretical chart showing how much extra return you should expect for taking on more risk. Investments that seem riskier must appear to promise higher returns, or no one would make them. This is why long-term treasuries, which are slightly riskier due to interest rate fluctuations, typically yield more than short-term ones. Why high-yield or junk bonds offer more than investment-grade corporate bonds. Why stocks generally offer higher returns than bonds.
Makes sense.
And why venture capital, the riskiest of all, aims for astronomical returns compared to publicly traded stocks. These are risk premiums for bearing incremental risk. When risk aversion is appropriately present, it acts as a market stabilizer. Investors approach with caution, perform careful analysis, demand healthy risk premiums, and refuse deals that make no sense, effectively keeping markets safe and sane.
But then what happens when risk aversion is insufficient? When it completely melts away during a boom, ultimately leading to a crisis? You hinted at the global financial crisis as an example.
That's precisely the dangerous part of the cycle, and it's the setup for almost every financial crisis. In good times, increased optimism leads to a pervasive increase in risk tolerance. He points to the lead-up to the global financial crisis, 2007-08, as the quintessential example. Government policies actively encouraged home ownership for those who historically couldn't afford it. The Federal Reserve consistently lowered interest rates, and banks, in turn, aggressively packaged and sold mortgages with an unquestioning extrapolation of low default rates from past, more normal periods.
Right, assuming the good times would last forever.
Exactly. Lending standards declined precipitously, leading to the proliferation of novel and untested mortgage-backed securities. MBS, that promised high returns with seemingly low risk. Regulations were relaxed. Glass-Steagall, which separated commercial and investment banking, had been repealed, and rules like the uptick rule were removed, further loosening guardrails. The media, too, perpetuated narratives that risk had been eliminated by adroit Fed management and new Wall Street innovations. The cumulative result was that risk tolerance dominated the psyches of investors, lenders, borrowers, and regulators across the board.
Everyone drank the Kool-Aid.
Pretty much. This led to unsafe financial behavior, the creation of unsound instruments, and a notorious race to the bottom, where lenders competed by accepting ever more risk. You remember Citigroup CEO Charles Prince's infamous quote from 2007, "As long as the music's playing, you've got to get up and dance. We're still dancing."
Chilling in retrospect.
It is. The impact on the capital market line, that theoretical risk-reward graph, is a significant flattening of its slope. This means the risk compensation, or the juicy extra yield you get for bearing that risk, effectively shrinks. You're taking on enormous danger, but you're simply not getting paid for it, commensurate with the actual risk. The most profound takeaway here, and a recurring lesson, is that the greatest source of investment risk is the belief that there is no risk. This widespread complacency and a collective disregard for risk is the perfect kindling for a crisis.
And then, when a crisis hits, risk aversion swings to the opposite extreme, becomes excessive. What does that look like on the ground, and how do wise investors react when everyone else is terrified?
It's a complete mirror image of the boom, but with far more painful consequences. Negative events like the post-Lehman Brothers bankruptcy in late 2008 trigger an immediate and pervasive shift to excessive risk aversion. Fear completely replaces confidence.
Panic selling.
Exactly. Sellers flood the market in a desperate attempt to liquidate assets. Buyers disappear, asset prices collapse, and liquidity, the ability to easily buy or sell an asset without impacting its price, simply vanishes. He recounts Oaktree's own experience with their levered funds facing margin calls as loan prices plummeted to unprecedented levels. They had to raise additional equity from investors multiple times in very difficult market conditions just to stay afloat.
Wow.
He vividly describes a conversation with a pension fund that, despite absurdly high yields on offer for distressed assets, like 15–20% on senior secured loans, was too fixated on historical default rates to see the opportunity. Their risk models were screaming danger, even though the prices had fallen so far that the potential upside was enormous.
They couldn't see past the fear.
Precisely. This period led to his profound epiphany. Skepticism calls for pessimism when optimism is excessive, but it also calls for optimism when pessimism is excessive. This is the essence of contrarianism, doing the opposite of what others do, or leaning against the wind.
Easier said than done.
Oh, absolutely. In late 2008, people succumbed to the wind, gripped by a pessimism that fed on itself, creating a vicious cycle of fear and selling. Warren Buffett's wisdom perfectly encapsulates the contrarian approach. The less prudence with which others conduct their affairs, the greater the prudence with which we should conduct our own affairs. When others are terrified, when assets are being sold indiscriminately regardless of their fundamental value, that's precisely when a wise investor should turn aggressive, albeit cautiously and analytically. At this extreme, excessive risk aversion dramatically steepens the capital market line, offering unusually generous risk premiums. The reward for bearing risk is greatest at just the moment when people absolutely refuse to bear it. This is where the true opportunities are forged.
This sounds like an incredibly powerful force. But how does the credit cycle fit into this, and why is it considered by some to be the most volatile of the cycles and one with the greatest impact?
The credit cycle, while often less well known to the man on the street, is of paramount importance and profound influence, precisely because of its volatility and its catalytic effect on other cycles. It's incredibly responsive to even small economic developments, and small fluctuations in the economy can produce large, sometimes devastating fluctuations in the availability of credit. This, in turn, profoundly impacts asset prices and the economy itself. At its core, the credit market provides the essential financing for economic growth and investment. It also prices assets based on the perceived risk of default, and perhaps most critically, it directly influences the psychology of both borrowers and lenders. When the credit market seizes up and closes, it spreads fear and creates vicious circles that are part of most financial crises.
The lifeblood dries up.
You could say that. He summarizes the credit cycle's relentless operation as a continuous chain reaction. Prosperity brings expanded lending, which leads to unwise lending, which produces large losses, which makes lenders stop lending, which ends prosperity, and on and on. The cruel irony is that the worst loans are made at the best of times.
Because standards get lax.
Exactly. This leads to widespread capital destruction through a race to the bottom, where lenders, competing for deals in a hot market, progressively offer lower yields and riskier structures, essentially abandoning prudence. The winner of these lending competitions is often the loser in the long run. Conversely, ice-cold markets, where buyers are scarce, demand high yields, and insist on strong protections, create environments where real winners are made as the reward for providing capital is exceptionally high. Over-permissive capital, cheap and abundant, aids and abets financial bubbles in areas like real estate, emerging markets, or new technologies. As he aptly puts it, if you offer cheap money, they will borrow, buy, and build, often without discipline.
That brings us directly to the global financial crisis, which you mentioned was a credit-driven crisis. Can you elaborate on that chain of events and how the credit cycle essentially blew up the financial system?
Absolutely. He describes the GFC as essentially a financial phenomenon caused almost entirely by events within the financial markets themselves, rather than a real economy downturn first. It began with too liberal attitudes towards financial risk, fueled by a strong demand for high-yielding investments, largely because the Fed had kept interest rates so low.
Okay.
This led to an excessive willingness to accept innovative financial products like mortgage-backed securities, MBS. The demand for these MBS then spurred a need for more mortgages, allowing lenders to be incredibly careless in choosing borrowers. This was the era of subprime or liar loans, mortgages given to people with poor credit or without proper income verification.
Right, those NNC loans, no income, no job.
Precisely. Credit rating agencies, rather than being impartial arbiters of risk, were incentivized by profits to compete by offering inflated ratings, contributing to a widespread ratings inflation, where risky products were labeled as safe. Home affordability was artificially boosted by low teaser rates, with the false assurance that refinancing would always be available as home prices were guaranteed to rise.
But they weren't.
Which they weren't. Investment banks eagerly created complex, multi-layered products called tranched CDOs, that's short for collateralized debt obligations, essentially bundles of debt sliced into different risk levels. This created a profound moral hazard. Lenders, knowing they could package and sell off their risky loans to someone else, had far less incentive to be careful about who they lent to. They were offloading the risk onto unsuspecting investors. The igniter was the large number of subprime defaults in 2006, which completely contradicted the prevailing no nationwide wave of defaults canard.
The cracks appeared.
They did. This led to a cascade of downgrades for MBS, a rapid price collapse for these once highly rated securities, and a complete liquidity dry-up in the market for them. Mark-to-market requirements meant banks had to value their assets, like those MBS, at their current depressed market price, not what they hoped they'd be worth. This instantly revealed massive systemic losses across the banking system, shocking investors and triggering bank failures and bailouts. The crisis then spread as counterparty risk. The fear that one financial institution's failure would trigger another's led to the infamous Lehman Brothers bankruptcy in late 2008.
Which really set off the panic.
It triggered widespread panic, distressed selling, and capital markets slammed shut globally. This financial cataclysm resulted in what became known as the Great Recession. The recovery only truly began when debt prices fell so low that buying became attractive, reaching a point where all optimism has been driven out and panicked risk aversion is everywhere, making it impossible for prices to go any lower. That's when the potential for recovery and tremendous profit for those brave enough to buy truly arises.
Shifting gears to specific market cycles, how does the distressed debt cycle work? And what unique opportunities does it create for investors willing to venture into the debt of bankrupt or struggling companies?
The distressed debt cycle is a fascinating, often counterintuitive area of investment that focuses on buying the debt of companies teetering on the brink of bankruptcy or already in it. Opportunities in this niche arise from two essential ingredients, which themselves are cyclical. First, there's the unwise extension of credit. This occurs when initial strict lending standards combined with good returns in the high-yield bond market attract more and more capital into the lending space.
Money pours in.
Right. This influx of money leads to increased bond issuance and, crucially, allows bonds of progressively lower quality to be issued as lenders become less prudent and no longer insist on the same margins of safety or protective covenants. This process, as he vividly puts it, stacks the logs in the fireplace for the next financial bonfire. Lenders, blinded by competition and the desire for yield, essentially set themselves up for future losses. The second ingredient is an igniter. This is typically a recession that causes corporate profits to decline significantly, making it harder for companies to service their debts.
Okay.
This is often accompanied by a credit crunch that slams shut the credit window, preventing companies from refinancing their existing debts and leading to widespread defaults. Exogenous events like the Gulf War in the early 90s or the fallout from Michael Milken's imprisonment can exacerbate these conditions, triggering a wave of defaults that might have otherwise been avoided.
So the kindling catches fire.
Exactly. When the igniter arrives, those shaky bonds that shouldn't have been issued in the first place begin to fail. This leads to a powerful chain reaction. A slower economy makes debt servicing harder. Closed credit markets present refinancing. Defaults rise. Investor psychology is severely damaged, turning excessively risk-averse. Capital flees the sector. Prices of distressed debt cascade downwards and forced selling ensues. It's a powerful and dramatic sequence that is a direct interaction of other cycles in the economy, investor psychology, risk attitudes, and the credit market. Each affects the others, creating these significant, often deeply undervalued opportunities in distressed debt for those with the foresight and courage to buy when others are panicking.
Like buying used cars from someone desperate to sell,
Yeah.
if you know how to fix them.
That's a good analogy. Distressed debt is similar. It's buying the beat-up cars of the financial world when everyone else is running away, hoping you can fix them up and sell the parts for more than you paid.
And real estate has its own unique cyclical dynamics, largely due to long development times. Can you walk us through that development cycle? It sounds like it's ripe for oversupply and eventual busts.
Absolutely. The real estate cycle has a unique and critical element: the long lead times required for real estate development. Unlike financial markets, where transactions can happen almost instantly, building a new commercial tower or a large residential complex requires years, sometimes even a decade or more, for initial feasibility studies, site acquisition, complex design, securing permits, arranging financing, and then the actual construction.
A lot can change in that time.
A lot can change. Market conditions, from tenant demand to interest rates, can change dramatically during this lengthy process, creating inherent risk. The development cycle follows a regularly recurring pattern, almost like clockwork. 1. Bad times. This is the bust phase. Building activity is low, few new projects are initiated, and capital for development is constrained because lenders are cautious and investors have lost money. 2. Better times. As the economy recovers, demand for space rises. With few new buildings having been started during the downturn, supply tightens, causing existing rents and property prices to increase, vacancy rates fall.
Things look up.
3. Improved economics. This positive trend makes developers eager to build again. Capital providers grow optimistic, making financing available and cheaper. This boosts projected returns, fueling developers' desire to build more projects. 4. Ramp up in building starts. This is the boom. You see cranes fill the sky. Early projects succeed, further encouraging even more building, often leading to a frenzy of new construction starts.
The classic sign.
5. Long completion times. Here's the critical, self-defeating part. The buildings started during the boom phase often take years to complete. By the time they open, the broader economy might have already shifted to a bust or slowdown. This new supply, hitting a weakening market, adds significantly to vacancies and pressures rents and prices downwards. 6. Unfilled space. This oversupply leads directly back to bad times, with high vacancies, low building activity, and severely constrained capital, completing the cycle.
It's almost designed to fail eventually.
Well, the inherent risk here is that developers typically use high leverage, meaning they borrow a lot of money to fund projects. But changing conditions during those long lead times make projects highly risky. This leads to the cynical but often true adage in real estate: only the third owner makes money, meaning not the original developer or the initial lender who funded the project, but the shrewd investor who buys the distressed asset from the bank amid the bust and then rides the next upcycle.
That perfectly explains why a city might suddenly have a surplus of empty office buildings or condos. And what about the home prices always go up fallacy that was so prevalent before the GFC? That seems like another classic example of ignoring cyclical history.
That was a classic example of conventional wisdom overriding all rational cyclical understanding. Before the global financial crisis, many people, encouraged by lenders and a booming market, genuinely believed that home prices always go up. A dangerous red flag for any alert investor.
Right.
After the GFC, the sentiment flipped, with many believing the American dream of homeownership was over and demand permanently depressed. But the historical truth reveals neither extreme is accurate. He cites a fascinating study of a single Amsterdam house that was tracked from 1625 to 1973.
Wow, long time.
Centuries. It showed that over those centuries, its real property value, adjusted for inflation, increased by only 0.2% per year.
Barely anything.
Basically flat in real terms. This powerfully demonstrates long-term cyclicality in real estate, rather than constant guaranteed appreciation. It fundamentally refuted the "it's different this time" argument in housing. In the GFC, government encouragement for home ownership, coupled with relaxed mortgage availability and historically low interest rates, fueled rapidly rising home prices. This fostered the pervasive belief that home prices only go up, and the comforting canard that no nationwide wave of defaults could ever occur, because if you couldn't pay your mortgage, you could just sell the house for a profit.
Famous last words, again.
Indeed. Securitization of mortgages, MBS, CDOs, further inflated demand for mortgages, leading to increasingly careless lending practices like those liar loans, and an explosion in ratings inflation where risky loans were given top credit ratings.
Right.
This created a highly unsustainable situation that, true to cyclical form, predictably collapsed when the pendulum inevitably swung.
So we've covered a lot of ground, from the big picture of economic cycles down to the nitty-gritty of credit and real estate. Now, how do all these disparate threads, the economy, corporate profits, investor psychology, attitudes towards risk, and the credit markets weave together to create that overarching phenomena we call the market cycle?
It's truly a complex, dynamic, and interconnected system, a perpetual dance where each element influences and is influenced by the others. He explains it as a series of powerful feedback loops. In an upswing or a bull market, positive economic events and strong corporate profits feed investor psychology, leading to rising optimism, what Keynes called animal spirits, and an increasing tolerance for risk. This causes investors to be less demanding in terms of risk protection and prospective return, eagerly chasing returns, which in turn drives asset prices higher. This positive feedback loop continues, self-reinforcing, until it becomes excessive and unsustainable. In a downswing or a bear market, the reverse happens. Negative events or unmet expectations cause psychology to turn profoundly negative, risk aversion spikes, credit tightens dramatically, and asset prices fall as investors scramble for safety.
It's rarely a smooth ride, though, is it?
Definitely not. It's crucial to understand that this progression is not smooth. There are often dips, recoveries, and feints along the way. The market rarely moves in a perfectly straight line, even within a major cycle. However, the human element's dominance is key. He argues that the most important influences on market cycles are not just economics, but the deeply ingrained, often irrational aspects of human behavior.
Like what?
Things like fluctuating rational thinking, distorted views, like selective perception and confirmation bias, where we only see what confirms our beliefs, nonlinear utility, where we value avoiding a loss much more intensely than achieving an equivalent gain, gullibility in good times, and excessive skepticism in bad, constantly fluctuating risk tolerance and aversion, powerful herd behavior, and the deep discomfort of nonconformity when everyone else seems to be making money. And underlying all of it are the powerful primal emotions related to money: greed, envy, and fear of loss. These psychological factors don't just affect, but often exacerbate cycles, pushing them to irrational extremes.
This sounds exactly like it explains the common wisdom of the 3 stages of a bull market. Can you elaborate on that? Because it seems to capture the psychological shift perfectly.
It does. This framework is a crucial lens through which to view market peaks and valleys. 1. Few foresee improvement. This is the very bottom of a bear market, often after a crash or significant downturn. Psychology is at its lowest, credit is scarce, and prices have been pounded. This is when insightful, contrarian people, often the true value investors, buy. They see deep value and potential where others only see despair, and they're willing to go against the crowd.
The brave ones.
It's a lonely place to be, but often the most profitable. 2. Most recognize that improvement is underway. As the market begins its recovery and initial buyers are rewarded with early gains, the underlying fundamentals start to turn positive. More and more people respond, cautiously at first, and then jump into the market as the trend becomes clearer and fear subsides.
A crowd starts joining in.
Right. It's still possible to find good value here, but it requires more analysis. 3. Everyone believes things will get better forever. This is the euphoric peak, the final stage of a bull market driven by widespread irrational exuberance. Everyone wants in. Prices become ridiculously high, completely detached from underlying value, and the market is wildly overdone.
Wow.
This often involves a no price too high mentality where investors abandon all discipline. He cites the Nifty 50 stocks in the 1960s, where investors paid absurd multiples for seemingly growth companies, and the internet bubble of the late 1990s as classic examples. In those periods, the belief that certain companies were so good or so revolutionary that price didn't matter led to absurd valuations and ultimately massive losses for those who bought at the top. Many of the dot-com companies from 1999-2000 no longer exist, serving as a stark reminder. At the top, you see maximum psychology, euphoria, maximum availability of credit, easy money, maximum price, but paradoxically, minimum potential return and maximum risk all are reached at the same time.
The worst time to buy.
Essentially. Conversely, the bottom is characterized by the nadir of psychology, the absolute lowest point of investor confidence, a total inability to access credit. Credit markets are slammed shut. Minimum price. But most powerfully, maximum potential return and minimum risk all coincide. These progressions seem logically inevitable in hindsight, but human error and emotion lead to extremes and collapses, making them incredibly difficult to navigate in real time. Therefore, at a cyclical high, future returns are likely subpar and risk is elevated, while at a cyclical low, the potential for profit is unusually high for those brave enough to act.
So after all this, the big question remains, how do we cope with all of this? Is the goal to predict the next market move perfectly? Or is there a more realistic approach?
It's definitely not about perfect prediction. He explicitly states, I don't believe in forecasting. He finds most forecasters lackluster and says few can know enough about the future to consistently outperform the market over time.
So what's the alternative?
The solution isn't prediction, which is essentially crystal ball gazing, but rather to position our portfolios for what lies ahead by truly understanding where the market stands in its cycle. This means knowing whether it's in an optimistic boom, a fearful bust, or somewhere in between. He stresses a crucial realization. The risk in investing doesn't come primarily from the economy, the companies, or their balance sheets. It comes from the behavior of the market participants.
It's us. We're the risk.
In many ways, yes. It's our collective human actions that create the greatest dangers and the greatest opportunities. This insight is key to both avoiding harm and identifying when to be aggressive.
And he offers a kind of qualitative checklist for assessing the market climate, doesn't he? To help us take the market's temperature in real time.
Yes, he does. He provides a practical, qualitative checklist for taking the temperature of the market in real time. It's non-scientific and even a bit jocular, but incredibly insightful. It presents pairs of contrasting market conditions, like a vibrant, sluggish economy, eager, reticent lenders, high-low asset prices, high-low valuations, high-low risk premiums, low-high yields, high-low future returns, high-low risk, optimistic, pessimistic sentiment, easy, tight access to credit, widespread, limited use of leverage, and aggressive conservative behavior.
Okay, a whole list of indicators.
His advice is simple. If you find that most of your check marks are in the left-hand column, meaning everything looks vibrant, eager, high, easy, and aggressive, then hold on to your wallet. Caution is required.
Time to be careful.
Exactly. If most are in the right-hand column, implying sluggishness, reticence, low prices, tight credit, and pessimism, then it might be time to get aggressive. This is about being deeply observant of what's going on around us and, in particular, of investor behavior. It's about knowing whether the market is red hot and thus overpriced, or frigid and thus a bargain, and positioning yourself accordingly. It's taking the pulse of the crowd, not trying to predict tomorrow's news.
This all points very strongly to adopting a contrarian stance, doesn't it? Going against the herd, which is incredibly difficult in practice.
Precisely. It directly reinforces Warren Buffett's famous wisdom. Be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful. Or, as he rephrases it, when others are euphoric, we should be terrified. And when others are terrified, we should turn aggressive. It ultimately boils down to what you pay for it. Price and its relationship to intrinsic value is determined not just by fundamentals, but overwhelmingly by investor psychology and behavior. The key to understanding the cycle, therefore, involves both totally quantitative gauging of valuations, like looking at PE ratios, dividend yields, or cap rates, and an essentially qualitative awareness of prevailing market behavior and sentiment. This dual approach allows one to act appropriately given the current market climate, resisting the emotional pull of the crowd.
It sounds incredibly difficult to pull off in the moment, when emotions are running high. What are the limits to coping with these cycles, and how often do even the most skilled investors truly get it right?
He's incredibly candid about the difficulty. He acknowledges that the happy medium is rarely seen. Investors, as emotional beings, rarely maintain objective, rational, neutral, and stable positions.
We swing with the pendulum.
We do. Success in cycle positioning is extraordinarily hard and rare, typically achieved only at once-in-a-lifetime cyclical extremes, which, he notes, seem to happen about once a decade, perhaps a handful of times in a career. He admits his own firm, Oaktree, despite its reputation for shrewd contrarianism, has only made major successful cycle calls 4 or 5 times in 48 years.
Wow, that's not very often.
It really isn't. The challenge lies in operating with considerable uncertainty and having the intellectual fortitude and emotional discipline to stand up to my emotions and follow my conclusions. Certainty, he emphasizes, is simply unobtainable. Peter Bernstein, a great financial historian, wisely put it. The trick is to survive. Performing that trick requires a strong stomach for being wrong, because we are all going to be wrong more often than we expect. The future is not ours to know.
So humility is key.
Absolutely. It's about understanding that being wrong is inevitable, but learning from those errors and refining your process is where true long-term success resides. It's less about avoiding failure and more about failing intelligently.
So, if success itself is cyclical, meaning that the very act of achieving it often sows the seeds of future failure, what does that imply for individuals, companies, or even investment strategies?
It implies a profound truth about the nature of systems and human behavior. He references Peter Kaufman's concept of dialectical materialism, which, stripped down, simply means, as any system grows toward its maximum or peak efficiency, it will develop the very internal contradictions and weaknesses that bring about its eventual decay and demise.
Success breeding its own failure.
Exactly. Think of it as success breeding its own undoing. For human nature, success is a dangerous intoxicant. It often makes people think they're smart, leading to hubris and a reduction in self-doubt. They become less disciplined, disregard the margin of safety that led to their initial success, and start taking on excessive risk. He emphasizes, don't confuse brains with a bull market, meaning don't confuse a rising tide lifting all boats with your own genius.
Good advice.
Little of true value is learned from success. Instead, it often teaches dangerous lessons like money being easy and risk not needing worry. This kind of success can be hard to replicate and often proves cyclical rather than consistently serial. In terms of popularity, unusual profitability in a particular investment strategy or asset class inevitably attracts capital. This leads to overcrowding, driving down returns, and eventually leading to a regression to the mean, or worse.
Too many cooks spoil the broth.
You got it. As he puts it, nothing will work forever. Strategies that initially succeed eventually become too popular, attracting so much money and so many competitors that they stop delivering outsized returns. He cites convertible arbitrage as an example, a strategy that worked well until too many participants crowded the field, making attractive positions scarce and eroding profitability. The underlying truth is, true bargains exist when things are unpopular and ignored by the crowd. Once everyone jumps in, the opportunity shrinks. Even companies are subject to this cycle. He uses Xerox as a prime illustration. Once a near monopoly, its immense success led to complacency. By 1975, an antitrust resolution forced it to license its core patents, effectively opening the door for competitors who quickly undercut its prices. This disruption caused Xerox's market share to plummet and profits to suffer significantly. Companies can become fat and happy, bureaucratic, and lose their innovative edge when they are too successful. However, the good news is that failure also carries the seeds of success. Under attack, companies can regain motivation, streamline operations, shed losing businesses, and ultimately restructure and return to profitability, as Xerox eventually did. There is a clear and powerful cycle in business success and failure.
So even timing, which often feels like pure luck, can be approached more systematically.
Exactly. While luck certainly plays a part in any investment outcome, good timing doesn't have to be exclusively the result of luck. It comes from diligently assessing where we are in a cycle and having the courage to act on that assessment. His own experience with high-yield bonds in the late 1970s and distressed debt in 1988 highlights this. He entered these asset classes when they were undiscovered, uncrowded, and thus bargain-priced, allowing for superior, outsized returns.
Getting in early.
Right, as he puts it, and it's a powerful warning for most investors. The latecomer to a now crowded field isn't the wise man in the beginning. Rather, he's more far likely to be the fool in the end.
Yeah.
This underlines Henry Phipps's astute observation from 1899. Good times like the present make bad times, a law sure as the swing of the pendulum. The lesson is to seek out value where it's currently unappreciated, not where it's being universally celebrated.
So we've explored the past and present of cycles, how they manifest in economies, markets, and even human psychology. But what about the future? Will it be different this time? Are we finally going to tame the business cycle with all our modern tools and knowledge?
He emphatically dismisses that idea, and it's perhaps his most enduring point. His core belief is that the tendency of people to go to excess will never end. And because those excesses inevitably correct, often violently, neither will the occurrence of cycles.
So no end in sight.
Not according to him. Economies and markets have never moved in a straight line, and they won't in the future, regardless of new technologies or policies. He points to numerous historical predictions of cycle tamed, from a 1996 Wall Street Journal article claiming the big bad business cycle has been tamed, to Herbert Hoover's notoriously optimistic statements in 1928-29 on the eve of the Great Depression, and the widespread Great Moderation belief post-2003, which suggested volatility was permanently reduced.
They were all wrong.
Every time. All were inevitably followed by significant downturns. He uses Richard Feynman's insightful quip, "Imagine how much harder physics would be if electrons had feelings."
Huh.
The profound point is, people do have feelings, and these make outcomes variable and cyclical. Humans are emotional and inconsistent, not steady and clinical. Psychology plays a dual, often destructive role. It magnifies forces to extremes, causing investors to overreact or underreact. And it also causes market participants to overlook the cyclicality of cyclical things at just those moments when recognition of excesses is most essential and most potentially profitable. He also consistently warns against the silver bullet fallacy, the dangerous recurring belief in a risk-free return or a sure thing.
If it sounds too good to be true.
It probably is. If such a thing existed, he argues, it wouldn't be offered to you, or its price would immediately be driven up until it no longer offered a sure thing. It's a fundamental economic truth that return is always tied to risk. His conclusion is unequivocal. Cycles will never stop occurring. They are a fundamental, irreducible aspect of economies, businesses, and markets, driven by inconsistent human behavior. Therefore, ignoring cycles and extrapolating trends is one of the most dangerous things an investor can do. The lessons of overdoing and eventual correction will always apply, regardless of the year or the prevailing technology.
So what does this all mean for you as you navigate the constant shifts of the financial world? Perhaps the true mastery of market cycles isn't about perfectly predicting the next turn, but cultivating the rare foresight to recognize when others are dancing blindly, and having the courage to sit out the tune, or even change the song, when everyone else is caught up in the rhythm. It's about having a profound understanding of probabilities in human nature, and the discipline to act on that knowledge.
Indeed. And it also means recognizing that the most valuable lesson is not to avoid being wrong, which is inevitable for all investors. Instead, it's about understanding why you are wrong, learning from it, and continuously refining your ability to discern the underlying patterns that will, in their own unique way, always rhyme. It is in this humility, this commitment to continuous learning from history, and this willingness to stand apart from the crowd that true, enduring success resides.